late 1700s, and this was the highway. The lake was the highway. There were no roads. There were paths, and people rode horseback more than even with a wagon. It was pretty bad around the lake. There were no railroads, and there were no steamboats. So the lake was very busy trading with Canada. Everybody down here always did, whether it was legal or not, I guess. And the lumber trade was the big trade, and Burlington was the lumber center. And the waterfront was very busy, and they transported the lumber on all kinds of craft. They had their sailing boats, they had barges, schooners, and sloops. And there was one that was very popular. It was called the Cynthia. It was a sloop, and it used to run up and down the Richelieu and go all around the lake. And it was on the lake for a good many years because it was the Rockwells were on it finally, and they didn't get here until 1808. They came to South Hero, and they settled right on the southwest shore, and Rockwell Bay was named after them. That's where they settled. So then they gradually kept going north, and they finally ended up in Alburgh. And this Cynthia, the captain of it at one time was a Rockwell, an older brother, and he took his little brother on, L. Rockwell, who was 13 at the time, as a deckhand. And when L was 17, his brother was captain of another boat, so he moved up to captain of the Cynthia, and he took his little brother on, which was my great-grandfather, Sumner J., and he was 12. So that was the way they went in families like that. So the steamboats were the only ones on the lake. In 1808, two men by the name of Winans, John and James, decided they'd build a steamboat on the shore of Burlington. So they got it all built early in the summer, and they thought they'd launch it. So they got a gang together, and they went down and they tried to launch it sideways, and they got it stuck in the mud. So then, in those days, they had what they called spirit parties. So they got some spirits, and that drew the crowd. They got a big crowd, and after a few spirits, they all pushed, and boy, they launched it. And then after that one, they decided to build the Ty. There was another Ticonderoga. It was a Ty 1. And this one was commandeered for the Revolution by McDonough. And it was in the Battle of Plattsburgh, and it got sunk there. And a few years ago, Art and I went down to Whitehall, and there it was, under a roof, what was left of it. And the hull was in terrible shape. Well, anyway, they were going to name it the McDonough. McDonough's the one that took it and put it in the Navy, so they named it the Ty No. 1, and it was sunk at the Battle of Plattsburgh. Then the next boat that was built was the Phoenix 1. And it was about 146 feet long, and it had 45 horsepower, and it went 8 miles. By the way, that first one went 3 miles an hour. This one went 8. Then the next one was the Champlain 1. And they were sort of forced into building this one because they caught wise that the Winnan boys were going to build another boat and compete with their boat. So they didn't want competition with the Phoenix because the Phoenix was doing pretty well. So they bought the half-built boat. And the Champlain and the Phoenix both burned within 4 years. The Phoenix burning was rather tragic, but the captain at that time really saved a lot of lives. It was a young Mr. Sherman, Richard Sherman. His father was the captain, and he was sick, so he put his son in charge of the boat, and it caught fire. And he stood where they were lowering the lifeboats with a pistol in each hand to keep order so that the people would wait until the boat was actually lowered, and then he'd limit the number in the boat. The only problem was there weren't enough boats for everybody. And after this, people were afraid to go on these crazy steamboats But then one of the passengers wrote an article and got it in the paper that this fire wasn't caused by the engine. It was caused by a candle that had been left in the pantry and tipped over. So they came back to sailing again, but it was kind of slow business for a while. Then they built 2 more boats, the Congress and the Phoenix II. The Congress was unique because they had a different concept about, they weren't just taking people across, ferrying them where they need to go. They were a sightseeing boat. They took them to Ticonderoga, and they let them stay for an hour and look the fort over, and they took them to Crown Point and reviewed the battlegrounds around the islands. And the Phoenix II was the longest boat they had. That was 150 feet. And it was, for a short time, it was the fastest boat in the world. And they had a very distinguished passenger on this boat. It was the Marquis de Lafayette. So that was their claim to fame. Now, in 1823, there was a big change. The Champlain Canal opened, and this opened everything right down to New York City, if you could stand it. Now, at this time, there were only 2 steamboats on, the Congress and the Phoenix II. Then they built the Franklin. And the Franklin had the most horsepower of any so far. They keep cranking them up. This was 75 horsepower. And they did something with the Franklin that made it a lot safer. They moved the engines from down below to put them up on what they called the guards. So that eliminated the danger of explosions. And it also had a few creature comforts. They had a covered promenade, so if it was storming, people didn't get wet. And the berths were a little larger, and they had 84. See, it took these boats so long to go, they had to put the people to bed. You know, they had these, but they weren't very, very good accommodations. Now, the old steamboat company got absorbed by a bigger one, but I forgot something to tell you about a character that I can't skip him. He was called Admiral King, and when the sailboats were all running this way and that way on the lake, he was the boss. He's the one that called himself Admiral King. And if they didn't work with him and take his products or let him buy their boat, they lost their boat. He'd capsize them, he'd burn them, he'd do anything he wanted. He had a monopoly. Whoops. So now this new company was sort of superseding these smaller ones. My grandfather worked for a Burley steamboat company for a while, and that was taken over by this one. Then we had a Grand Isle steamboat company here, and I'll tell you about that one later. And there were several like this. Well, this Lake Champlain Steamboat Company took them all over, and so there was a monopoly, and people weren't too happy about it. But then the next one, oh yes, we come to the prettiest boat on the lake. It was the Burlington. And they called her the mistress of the lake. They really made her very luxurious. And the captain was Captain Sherman, the one that handled the pistols during the fire on the Phoenix. And he was a very meticulous person, and he ran his boat in a very military fashion. There was nothing out of place, and everybody was shined up, and it was the first time they had uniforms. It was real class. And it seems that Martin Van Buren, the president at the time, took a ride on it, and Charles Dickens did. And Charles Dickens called it a floating palace. And it was one of the few things he complimented us about over here in America. He didn't think much of America. We were, well, I don't know, we just didn't come up to his standard over in England. But he did like this boat, and it had a sister ship that they didn't intend to have a sister ship, but there was a man who was on the board of the Champlain Transportation Company, and he had a lot of money, and he was always building boats. He was down Whitehall Way, and they caught wise he was building a boat. And he was making it just about the same size as the Burlington. They didn't want a competition like that, so they bought the boat. And they decided that they would improve the transportation by running, they called the ones that went the length of the lake line boats. They'd start one in Whitehall and the other would start in St. John's, and they'd meet. And so they called it the sister ship, and they named it the Whitehall. But they had to tie him down because he'd just go off and build another one. So they made him sign an agreement to not build another boat or not hire anyone to build another boat for 8 years. And that wasn't quite enough, so then they gave him a position in the company and paid him $1,000 a month. So the Whitehall and the Burlington ran opposite lines, and everything went fine with those two. Then they decided they were pretty expensive because they were big boats, so they thought they'd build a smaller one, and they were going to name it the Saranac. Well, they were building the Saranac, and it was a nice boat, and they liked it, and everything was going along fine. They charged, now you'll like this, they charged $5 to go the length of the lake, and that included your board and berth. And to top it all up, they were complaining that was too much. Then, all of a sudden, Comstock's time was up. His 8 years was up, and he was at it again. And he thought, you know, he had a pretty good deal. So he thought, well, they'll buy this, and I'll be all set. They said, never mind, let him compete. So he built this boat, and he named it the Francis Saltus. Francis Saltus was a little bit faster than the Saranac. So they raced, and they had exactly the same schedule. So they'd come into a wharf, and they'd be docked on each side. And then one had tried to slip away before the other one did to get to the next place. They were even known to skip stops if they didn't think many people would be there. And later they built a new boat, the United States. And this one went 19 miles an hour, and it was 50 feet longer than anything else on the lake. And it was actually longer than the Ticonderoga that's down at the museum. That's how long a boat it was. And it was faster than any others. They're after speed. Captain Anderson was the man. And when he launched it in Burlington, he was going to show that Saltus. So he let the Francis Saltus get out of the bay a little bit. And he sailed out, and he gradually gained on it, and he went past it, and everybody hooved out in the boat at them. So they had a boat faster than that Saltus, so they were all happy. Now we come, the railroads are getting into this. I knew this would get to a railroad sooner or later. And for a time, their tracks were not complete. There was some on this side and some on the other side of the lake. So they built a boat that they called the Oaks Ames to carry the cars across to get the other lines back and forth across the lake. And the company bought this, and they decided to convert it. They didn't need it anymore because the railroads had finally got their lines complete. So they decided to convert it into a passenger boat, and they named it the Champlain II. And they had one very good season. Everything went very well. And the crew on this, the president was George Rushlow, the president, the captain. The first pilot was John Eldridge. Remember this name, it's important. The second pilot was Al Rockwell. And the second season they were on, and I think this is time I'm going to ask Chris to read, and I can get a drink of water and sit down a minute, and she's going to read verbatim a report that Uncle Al made because of an accident. And it's his report to the company, and you'll notice the mannerisms of writing reports and talking and so on. So I'll take a break while she reads. Take my gadget.
Take your gadget off. This begins by saying the wreck of the Champlain II, as told by Uncle Ed. Uncle L. Oh, L. E-L-L. Okay. Uncle L. It was a bright, clear moonlight night, and we were running from Fort Ticonderoga to Rouse's Point. My watch took me as far as Westport, where I was to have been relieved by senior pilot, Mr. Eldridge. When Mr. Eldridge came on watch, I saw that he was a little gruff. He said to me, "Will you take her out of Westport for me?" So I did. I told him a story about an Irishman who had had a fight with the purser as we were approaching Port Henry. This seemed to brace him up, and he lighted his pipe and took the wheel, and I started for bed. My cabin opened into the pilot house. I had just thrown off my coat when the crash came. For a moment, I thought it was a collision between us and the Adirondack, and I listened perhaps 5 seconds for an explosion. Then I got on my feet and entered the pilot house. Mr. Eldridge stood with his right hand holding the wheel, looking at the side of the mountain. He turned coolly to me and said, "Elle, can you account for my being on the mountain?" I said, "Yes, Mr. Eldridge, you were asleep." He replied, "Elle, as God is my judge, I was steering the vessel on what I deemed to be her true course." Captain Rushlow immediately appeared from his room on the main deck aft, and he said, "Let's go forward and see what's happened." We went forward and saw that she had run between Steam Mill Point and the mountain. Her bow was up out of water, and she had broken her back. She was going full speed when she went on the rock. The after end was under water up to the salon deck. Captain Rushlow was fearful lest the vessel should break in half and the stern end slide into the deep water, so he directed that the lifeboats be lowered in readiness to receive the passengers. He then had the crew cut up some of the deck planks and laid them from the port quarter onto the side of the mountain so that the passengers would be able to walk to the shore across these planks if the ship slipped back into the lake. We had about 80 passengers on board that night. The captain then told me to take a lifeboat and a crew and go out and meet the Adirondack and have her come alongside and take our passengers. I did so. We went about 3 miles when we met the Adirondack, Captain Anderson in command. We brought the Adirondack up to the wreck of the Champlain, and they took all our passengers. Captain Rushlow then sent for me again. He said, "Mr. Rockwell, I saw a schooner going into Young's Bay. You had better fetch her, and we will transfer the freight." We had about $4,000 worth of freight aboard. So we went up to Young's Bay to get the schooner, and I went aboard and woke up Captain Connor and his wife. I told him we had lost the Champlain, and that my crew was getting the schooner underway, and that we were going to bring her to the wreck to take the freight. When we got back to the Champlain, I found that the captain had sent the steward into Westport to get something for the crew to eat. The galley and dining room were all under water, but the captain said if we could get in the upper end of the dining room, we could get some food and knives and forks. So we cut a hole through the bulkhead and put a small waiter through, but he came back a-flying and said there was a dead man in there. We cut the hole larger, and I went in. There was a man lying on the berth. The side of the ship was stove in within 2 feet of his head. About 4 feet of water was in the room, and his shoes were floating in it. One corner of his berth was under water. I placed my hand on his arm, and it felt warm. I shook him, and he woke up. It appeared that he was a law student who had just passed his bar examination the day before, and he had been celebrating and had slept through all the wreck.
And to finish out about poor Mr. Eldridge, he had a very serious back. Whoops, I'm hooked. That's all right. Okay. Back problem, and he'd been taking morphine, and he was a drug addict, and he disappeared. And they only heard from him once more. He wanted some money, and nobody ever heard from him again. It was sad because I guess he was one of the best. Now we come to Uncle El's boat, or I call it Uncle El's boat. It was the Reindeer. And the Reindeer is the only side-wheeler that was never owned by the Champlain Transportation Company. Uncle El and some others raised money. They got people to invest in it. And as that Cohen says, you could always tell when they were going to build a new boat because they'd sell their house, they'd sell their cows, they'd sell their present boats and so on. And I think that was the time that Uncle El moved from, he owned at one time the stone house down where the campground is, and he moved in where Carol lives. They raised the money, and they got backing from the railroad, too. They had a lot of reinforcements. And they built this little side wheel, and they built it right here in Alburgh. They called it the shipyard, and it was just south of the campground, Goose Point, on that side of the road. Doesn't look like a shipyard now, but they tell me that's where it was. And it had something unique. The paddle wheel had a reindeer, jumping over it like this, and it was a bright color. And I saw it in the picture, and I kept thinking, I've seen that before. And in Aunt Jo's house, Aunt Jo was Uncle El's daughter, the homestead, there was a picture on the wall of this reindeer jumping over something like that. It was a picture on the wall, and they evidently had it painted to put on the paddle wheel of the boat. Well, the reindeer was a nice little boat, and it ran for 10 years, and it ran right along with the Maquam. And the Maquam was about the same size, and they used to do the local Burlington, St. Albans, Maquam, Isle of Mont, Chazy, Plattsburgh, this end of the lake. I don't think they went the other. And the Maquam had a peculiarity. It liked to roll. They never could get the roll out of it quite. If there was a wave, the boat rolled. Well, they had teenagers then, too. And when they'd come on as passengers, they thought it was great sport to run to one side of and then to the other, and they'd get the boat rolling until the captain would have to come down and set them down somewhere. There was another line of boats at the same time, and those were the work boats, the tugboats. And by now the Champlain canal was open from St. John's on, so that you could go from New York to Montreal. And these tugboats used to pull the canal boats through the lake. And that was what my grandfather did most of his life. In fact, most of his life. He started out on the Burley, which was one of the early tugboats. And it was owned by the Burley Steam Company. That was one of the ones that was taken over later. And then he went to the Tisdale, and he was on the Defender, and the Weatherby. The Weatherby, they had Weatherby mines over in New York, and they used to pick up coal. You'd bring those barges through. And the Robert S. Cook. And the Robert Cook was his favorite, and that's the one my father grew up on. When I always called my father Joel. And when he was old enough that his mother thought she could keep him from falling overboard, she'd get his schoolwork in the fall and then again in the spring, and she tutored him until he went to high school. And she went on board to cook for the crew, and the engineer's wife went on. So they had 2 ladies on there and 1 kid. And what does a boy do on a boat from one end of the lake to the other? It sounds pretty boring. He used to fish, and he never touched a fish pole that I remember. And when they get into a place, he had this little sailboat the engineer made him, and he'd play with it on the dock. And the engineer told him that in the winter he'd make him a real good one, and he did. He made him a schooner that had 2 masts, and he named it the 3 Feathers. And that really would sail. They could set the rudder, and it would go right where they wanted it to. There was a storm. I should tell you about that. We've got to have some excitement here. This was the last run they were making, and my father was 17, I believe, at the time. And it must have been around Thanksgiving, or he would have been in school, I imagine. But it was very cold, and you know how it can get at the end of November sometimes. And they were coming into Westport, and a boat came out and told them that the Defender was having trouble and couldn't get across the lake. The wind was blowing so hard it couldn't make any headway. Wanted my grandfather to go out and tow him in, help him. So he said he had to take care of his canal boats. He had about 20 on behind. So he put them in the cove at West Point, and he told my father, he said, "There's something wrong down under the boat, I think." why don't you go down and look? He says, I can't figure out what it is, but I just have a feeling there's something that isn't right. So he said, you get the lantern and the workboat, and somebody else went with him. They went down, they looked, and they couldn't see anything wrong. So he told them, they started across the lake. And they got across, and they found the Defender, and some of its boats had broken loose, and it was making a little headway. So the captain said, why don't you pick up the boats, the canal boats that have broken away, and I think I can keep going. So he said, okay. So he was getting the boats, and he went to come around, and when he changed directions, all of a sudden everything froze, and he couldn't move. The boat wouldn't go anywhere. So he dropped an anchor, and plus a sea anchor, and everything else they could put to try to hold the boat there. And he told my father, he said there were about 3 or 4 that had broken away from the chain that he still had hooked to his boat. And one was going up on the fill, they were talking about it today, from South Hero to Grand Isle. And he told Jewel to take the boat and go over there and see if he could get the train to stop and pick them up, because there was a man on there that was sick. He had diabetes, and he was very sick. And he was on his way home. He wasn't going to do it anymore. So Jewel got over there, and there was someone he could talk to. They had, I don't know what you call them on the railroad, but there was someone he could talk to. Well, who do you call him, Calvin? A signal. Yeah, a signal. And he said he couldn't have them stop the train, because Jewel was 17. He thought he was a kid, So he went back on the railroad track, and I guess he was signaling with his lantern, and the train stopped for him. And they took the man in, and they took the other people in. The Defender got to the other side, and the next morning they came and towed my grandfather's boat into Burlington and fixed it. So that was the storm. Okay, the last 3 steamers, the big ones, are the ones that I'm familiar with personally, because I had a chance to ride on all of them. And the oldest one was the Chateauguay, and that was the first one built. It was the smallest of the 3, but it lasted the longest. It had an iron hull, and it ran for 42 years on Lake Champlain. When the cars began to get numerous, of course, the business was falling out. You could see the writing on the wall. This was the end of this kind of boating. And so they revamped it and fixed it so they could take cars. And I can remember we took our car on, and they wouldn't let the driver have anything to do with his car. They parked them, and they blocked every wheel and balanced them and everything. And they managed to keep going that way. And when they were finally sold, they went to Lake Memphremagog to replace Washington, the Washington boat, because it burned, Mount Washington. And they renamed it Washington II. Now, the steamer Vermont was the largest of the 3, and it was the most luxurious. It was, to my way, it was just beautiful. I loved it. And I can remember standing on the pier ready to go on the boat and just waiting for that, to see that coming across the lake. You'd hear the whistles, and it would take forever to go around that breakwater. And then it would come sliding into the dock. Uncle L, 98 years old probably by that time, and he'd come out on the bridge and give the directions, and then the gangplank would come down, and passengers would come off, and we'd rush on and be off. And the inside of that boat was just like a lush hotel. The carpets were bright red. The we didn't call it a dining room, you had to call it a dining cabin. Had beautiful mahogany furniture. That was throughout the boat, mahogany, and with the white linen and the boat's dishes and the silver shining. So everything was classy and shined up, and it was really very nice. And Uncle L was the captain. And when Uncle L was 93, they invited him to come to Boston, and they gave him a banquet on the largest boat in the world, because he was the oldest captain in the world. And believe it or not, I never saw him wear glasses. They have a little pair of spectacles at the museum that they called his reading glasses. But if he did, I think they were in his pocket more than they were on his eyes, because he really didn't. He read a lot. All those men read. That was their recreation on the boat. But he was thrilled with that boat, and the captain told someone that this was in a paper article in the Tampa News down in Florida about this reunion. And they said that the captain of the Majestic, that was the name of the boat at that time, they never saw anybody crawl in and around everything on that boat to inspect it. They said he didn't miss a thing on that big, huge boat. And then the other thrill that he had was he went to a brand new baseball park, the Fenway Park, and saw a Red Sox game. And the Vermont 3, I have a very sad picture that I will show you what happened to her. When she was decommissioned, they took her whole upper structure off. I didn't tell you what her capacity was. I probably should. She was 260 feet long. Her horsepower was 1,800. She had 50 staterooms, and she went 23 miles an hour. And, they decommissioned her, and they took her superstructure off, everything that was beautiful, and sent her down to Virginia. And she was a freight boat then. And I have a picture of her, and she has a lot of barrels of something on, and it's not very pretty. And, of course, we all know what became of the Ty. I imagine most of us have been down to the museum to see her. And my father worked on her for a while, too. And I think that's enough. We got them all.